My name is Anna. I'm in my 30s now, but this story begins when I was younger, still steadying myself in a professional world that rewards confidence loudly and punishes it quietly. At the time, I worked behind the scenes in a role that was dependable, technical, and rarely celebrated. The kind of role where people say, "We'd be lost without you," and then forget to look at you when decisions are made. People usually described me as calm, reliable, low maintenance. The words sounded like compliments, but they often carried an assumption that I would not challenge what was handed to me, that I would absorb pressure without resistance, that I would stay grateful for proximity to power instead of questioning how it behaved. I've always been aware of how I'm perceived, soft-spoken, observant, not the type to make scenes. What most people didn't notice was that I remember everything: patterns, numbers, tone shifts, small changes in behavior that tell you more than big speeches ever do. This is not a story about revenge, and it's not a story about sudden heroics or dramatic takedowns. It's a story about what happens when power doesn't like being challenged, especially when the challenge comes quietly, legally, and without spectacle. My boss used company money illegally, then came after me, but that only captures the surface of what unfolded. What really happened lived in the margins: emails that didn't sit right, requests that crossed lines without announcing themselves, and a growing understanding that loyalty is often expected most from those who benefit least. I want to be clear about something early on. I didn't set out to expose anyone. I didn't wake up one day wanting justice or vindication. I wanted stability, fairness, to do my job well and go home without my integrity feeling compromised. What changed wasn't my temperament, it was my clarity. This story moves slowly because real life does. It's about silence that was mistaken for compliance, about preparation that looked like passivity, about choosing restraint not out of fear, but out of precision. There are moments when I stay quiet longer than most people would, and moments where that quiet made all the difference. I'm telling this now not to relive it and not to dramatize it, but because I know how common these situations are, especially for people who are useful, ethical, and underestimated. If you've ever felt invisible in a system that depends on you, if you've ever sensed something was wrong but weren't sure when or how to name it, then you may recognize parts of yourself in this journey. I'll tell it honestly, calmly, without exaggeration. No villains, no heroes, just choices, consequences, and the kind of emotional justice that doesn't announce itself when it arrives. Before we go further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that staying quiet didn't mean you were powerless? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that came up most often in performance reviews, hallway conversations, and emails copied to upper management. Anna's very dependable. Anna always handles it. We can give this to Anna. She won't make it complicated. Dependable sounds solid, safe, professional. But over time, I learned that in certain environments, it also means manageable. I worked in operations and internal finance support, not glamorous, not client facing. I didn't bring in revenue. I made sure it didn't disappear. I tracked expenses, reconciled accounts, flagged inconsistencies, and prepared reports no one wanted to read unless something went wrong. My role existed to prevent problems, which meant that when I did my job well, nothing happened. Silence was success. In meetings, I was usually there early, laptop open, notes ready. I spoke when asked. I didn't interrupt. When louder personalities filled the room, I shrank my presence, not out of insecurity, but habit. I had learned that the fastest way to be labeled difficult was to speak too precisely in a room that preferred confidence over accuracy. My boss liked that about me. He trusted me with details, numbers, sensitive access, things he didn't want to think about. He'd say, "You're good with this stuff," in a tone that meant, "I don't want to be bothered." When audits came up, he'd gesture vaguely in my direction and say, "Anna's got it." What he didn't say, but assumed, was that I wouldn't question why I had it. To my coworkers, I was background. The person you slack when something breaks. The one who stays late without announcing it. They shared jokes in group chats I wasn't in, then turned to me when something urgent needed fixing. No one was cruel. No one was overtly disrespectful. That's what made it harder to name. I wasn't excluded. I was unconsidered. At company lunches, I sat wherever there was space. At team celebrations, I clapped, smiled, and left early. When promotions were announced, I nodded for others and told myself timing mattered. Experience mattered, that staying steady would eventually be noticed. I believed genuinely that competence spoke for itself, but competence doesn't speak. It waits, and waiting can look a lot like compliance. Looking back, I see how clearly my role had been defined without my consent. I was the absorber, the buffer, the one who would catch things before they spilled into consequences, the one who made other people's decisions look cleaner than they were. I didn't resent it, not yet. I took a quiet pride in being trusted, in being the person systems leaned on. I told myself that visibility wasn't everything, that integrity mattered more than recognition, and it did. It still does. But integrity, when paired with silence, can be mistaken for something else entirely. They thought I was harmless, not weak, just neutral, someone who wouldn't escalate, someone who wouldn't push back, someone who valued stability more than truth. They were wrong about one thing. I noticed everything. I noticed which approvals were rushed, which explanations changed, depending on who was asking, which expenses were categorized just slightly off, consistently enough to form a pattern. I noticed how often I was told, "It's fine," instead of being shown why it was fine. At the time, I didn't label any of it as danger, just information. And information, I've learned, is only invisible until someone decides to see it. The first time it happened, it was so small, I almost dismissed it myself. It came in the form of a request, casual, offhand, wrapped in familiarity. My boss leaned against the doorway of my office, one hand on his phone, eyes already elsewhere as he spoke. "Hey, can you just run this through as miscellaneous? It'll save time." The number wasn't huge. The wording wasn't alarming. And the category he suggested wasn't wrong, just vague enough to swallow something that didn't quite belong there. I remember pausing with my fingers over the keyboard. Not because I was afraid, because something about the phrasing felt rehearsed, like he'd said it before. Like he already knew where the lines were and had learned how to step just beside them. I asked lightly, "Do you want to attach the receipt?" He smiled, not annoyed, amused. "Don't worry about it, it's covered." That was the first small cut. Not the request itself, but the assumption that I wouldn't need clarification, that I wouldn't insist on the paper trail, that my role was to smooth, not verify. I told myself it wasn't worth pushing back over something so minor. I told myself that systems have flexibility for a reason, that intent matters, that this wasn't my place to interrogate. So I processed it. Nothing happened. No alarms. No consequences. No sudden moral collapse. The world didn't tilt. My job remained intact. He didn't thank me, but he didn't need to. The unspoken exchange was clear. I trusted you with this. And that, I realized later, was the real test. After that, similar requests began to appear. Never identical, always justifiable in isolation. A charge coded differently. Just this once. A reimbursement was pushed through without full documentation because we'll fix it later. A budget adjustment was explained verbally but never written down. Each time I felt that same pause, that brief internal check, and each time I made a calculation. Is this worth friction? Is this the hill? Everyone else seemed unconcerned. When I mentioned one discrepancy to a colleague, she shrugged. That's how it works. Don't stress. So I didn't. Outwardly, but inwardly, something had shifted. Not into alarm, into attention. I began to notice how often I was the final gate before money moved. How rarely those decisions were reviewed after the fact. How easily a system built on trust could be bent by someone who knew exactly where trust lived. What struck me most wasn't the act itself. It was how naturally he came to me. Not accounting, not legal, me, because I was quiet, because I didn't broadcast concerns, because I hadn't given him any reason to think I would slow things down. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't even refuse. I just started doing one thing differently. I wrote things down, dates, amounts, wording, not opinions, facts, not in official systems, in my own notebook, the one that stayed in my bag that no one asked about. I told myself it was just good practice, that I was being thorough, that I was protecting the company, not preparing for conflict. And at the time, that was true. I still believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I believed mistakes could be clumsy, not calculated. I believed that if something ever truly crossed a line, it would be obvious. But lines don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they appear as small cuts, so clean you don't feel them until much later, when you look down and realize how often they've been made. That was the moment I stopped assuming innocence and started observing behavior, quietly, carefully, without changing my expression. Because the most dangerous thing you can do when power feels secure is let it believe nothing has changed. What happens slowly is harder to resist. That's what I learned next. After the first few requests, the tone changed. Not dramatically, just enough to register if you were paying attention. My boss stopped asking and started assuming. The phrasing shifted from, "Can you?" to "Just do this," from explanation to implication. And because I didn't push back the first time, my silence became part of the process. Disrespect doesn't usually arrive as cruelty. It arrives as familiarity without consent, as shortcuts are taken through your role, as decisions are made around you instead of with you, while still expecting you to clean up the edges. I told myself it was normal, that pressure trickles down, that leadership means delegation, and delegation isn't always gentle. I reminded myself that no one was singling me out maliciously, that this was just how fast-moving companies operated. But there was a difference between speed and dismissal. Meetings began to happen without me, even when the outcomes directly affected my workload. I'd find decisions already implemented, budgets already shifted, timelines already promised. Then I'd receive a message: "Hey, can you make this work?" Not, "Is this feasible?" Not, "What do you think?" Just, "Make it work." When I raised concerns, they were brushed aside with reassurance instead of answers. "It's fine. We've done this before. Don't overthink it." Overthinking. That word appeared more often than I liked. It's a subtle way to disarm someone who deals in details, to frame precision as anxiety, to turn diligence into inconvenience. So I adjusted. I shortened my explanations. I removed qualifiers. I stopped asking follow-up questions in public forums and saved them for private notes. I became easier. And in doing so, I felt myself recede. Not emotionally, I wasn't hurt, but professionally. My role narrowed from guardian to executor, from someone who understood the system to someone who simply kept it running, no matter what inputs were fed into it. The disrespect wasn't loud, it was procedural. My workload increased without discussion. Deadlines tightened without warning. Requests came late in the day with an expectation of overnight turnaround. When I delivered, there was no acknowledgement. When I hesitated, there was impatience. Still I stayed calm. Still I stayed polite. I rationalized everything. He's under pressure. This quarter is chaotic. Once things stabilize, it'll go back to normal. But normal had already shifted. I noticed how often my boss used my reliability as cover. He'd promise things upward, then lean on my quiet efficiency to fulfill them. If something didn't add up, it wasn't his call that was questioned. It was my execution. That was new. I began receiving feedback that felt indirect. Suggestions that I be more flexible, that I focus on solutions, not obstacles, that I trust leadership. Trust, I realized, was being used as a substitute for transparency. And still, I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because something in me understood that confrontation, at this stage, would only teach him how to hide better. Instead, I watched. I watched how often he redirected accountability, how he avoided written confirmation, how he grew irritated when I asked for clarity, even gently. I watched how easily he framed my caution as resistance when it was nothing more than responsibility. The most unsettling part was how ordinary it all felt. No shouting, no threats, no explicit wrongdoing, just a steady erosion of boundaries, the kind that makes you doubt your own perception, that makes you wonder if you're being too sensitive, too rigid, too slow. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day in a compromised position. You arrive there one small accommodation at a time. And because I'd been taught that professionalism meant endurance, I endured. But I didn't forget. Every dismissed concern, every undocumented decision, every moment I was asked to absorb risk that wasn't mine to carry. It all went into the same quiet place inside me, the place that doesn't react but records. Because there's a difference between being quiet and being unaware. And by then, I was very aware. It became clear to me not all at once, but in layers. The role I had been assigned wasn't written anywhere. It didn't appear in my job description or performance goals. No one announced it, but everyone behaved as if it were understood. I was the stabilizer, the one who would absorb overflow without complaint, the one who would translate half-formed decisions into workable systems, the one who would carry risk quietly so others could appear decisive. I wasn't expected to lead. I was expected to support, indefinitely. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. My boss didn't view me as a partner or even a subordinate with discretion. He viewed me as infrastructure, something reliable, necessary, and invisible. You don't consult infrastructure, you use it. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I noticed how often I was looped in after commitments were made, never before. How my expertise was referenced in meetings I wasn't invited to. Operations is fine with this, he'd say, meaning I would make it fine. When something went smoothly, the credit traveled upward. When something stalled, the pressure traveled downward. Still, no one raised their voice. No one threatened my job. There was nothing to point to and say, "This is wrong." That was the brilliance of it. I was being relied on and disregarded at the same time. And because I took my responsibilities seriously, I fulfilled the role. I fixed gaps. I anticipated problems. I protected the company from exposure, even when that exposure came from decisions I hadn't agreed with. But somewhere in that rhythm, a quiet question formed. Who is protecting me? The answer was obvious. No one. I began to understand why I'd been chosen for this role. Not because I was weak, but because I was ethical. Because I cared about doing things correctly. Because I wouldn't let systems fail just to make a point. That made me useful. And usefulness in the wrong hands becomes leverage. My boss didn't see himself as exploiting me. In his mind, he was delegating, optimizing, trusting. He assumed my silence meant alignment, that my continued performance meant consent, and I let him believe that, not because I agreed, but because I was learning how decisions were made, where accountability stopped, where documentation vanished, learning who benefited from ambiguity and who carried the risk when things went wrong. I stopped trying to be seen. I stopped correcting narratives in real time. I stopped volunteering explanations that no one wanted to hear. Instead, I refined my boundaries internally. I did my job, but I did it precisely. I followed policies exactly as written. I saved copies. I asked for confirmations in neutral language. I began to understand the difference between being helpful and being exposed. The role they assigned me required silence. What they didn't realize was that silence can be selective. There's a kind of power in not interrupting someone while they reveal how they think, in letting patterns complete themselves, in allowing assumptions to harden into habits. That's when truth becomes visible. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't angry. I was still committed to the company, to fairness, to doing things the right way. But I was no longer naive. I could see how easily the narrative could turn if something surfaced, how quickly the stabilizer could become the scapegoat, how responsibility without authority is a dangerous place to stand. And for the first time, I considered something I'd never allowed myself to consider before. What if staying quiet wasn't protecting anyone, but the wrong person? That question didn't demand an answer yet. It just waited. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic email, no moment where someone crossed a line so clearly that everything stopped. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in a nearly empty office, while I was doing something I'd done 100 times before. I was reconciling accounts. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after most people have gone home. The lights above my desk hummed softly. My screen was filled with rows of numbers that normally settled into place without resistance. That day, they didn't. One discrepancy refused to resolve. Not large enough to trigger alerts, but persistent. It traced back to several entries, spread over months, all routed through the same cost center. Individually, each one could be explained. Together, they formed something else. A pattern. I remember leaning back in my chair, not tense, just still. That familiar pause returned, but this time, it didn't pass. I pulled my notebook from my bag and flipped through pages I hadn't expected to matter. Dates aligned, wording repeated, the same justifications, the same approvals, and one name, my boss's. What shifted in that moment wasn't fear, it was clarity. I understood fully that this wasn't sloppiness or pressure or oversight. It was behavior, repeated, normalized, and protected by the assumption that no one would connect the dots. And I had connected them. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt responsible. Not for his actions, but for my position, because I realized something else, just as clearly. If this ever surfaced, it would not land where it belonged by default. Systems don't assign blame fairly, they assign it efficiently. And I was the one with access, the one who processed, the one whose name appeared in logs, reports, and timelines, the stabilizer. That was the moment I understood the risk I was carrying and that it was no longer theoretical. I closed the files. I shut down my computer. I sat there for a long time, letting the weight settle without rushing to label it. I didn't tell anyone, not a colleague, not a friend, not even myself, out loud. I went home, made dinner, and slept. The next morning, I came in early, not to confront, not to expose, to prepare. The internal change was subtle, but permanent. I stopped hoping the situation would correct itself. I stopped assuming good faith where evidence suggested a strategy. I stopped believing that my silence was neutral. Silence, I realized, was participation, unless it was deliberate. From that day on, every action I took had intention behind it. Not aggression, intention. I reviewed policies. I reread compliance guidelines I'd skimmed before. I documented processes more carefully. I ensured my own work was unimpeachable, clean, traceable, exact. I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't grow colder or more distant. If anything, I became more composed. And that's what no one noticed. They thought nothing had changed, that I was still the same Anna, quiet, capable, unassuming. They didn't see that the center of gravity had shifted, that I was no longer reacting to the environment. I was orienting within it. I wasn't planning an outcome. I was creating options. Because once you see the truth clearly, you can't unknow it. But you can choose how and when to let it matter. That was the day I stopped waiting for permission to protect myself. And everything after that unfolded from that single, quiet decision. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been instinctive, habitual, a byproduct of professionalism and restraint. Now, it was deliberate, chosen, and because nothing on the surface looked different, everyone else interpreted it the same way they always had. As compliance, my boss continued as usual. Requests came in the same tone, casual, confident, unquestioned. He still trusted me with access, still assumed I'd handle it, still spoke about me as if I were a function, not a person. What he didn't see was that I had stopped absorbing ambiguity. Every request now passes through a filter. Can I do this? But should I? Not emotionally, procedurally. Was it documented? Was it defensible? Was it aligned with policy? If it was, I executed it cleanly. If it wasn't, I didn't refuse outright. I asked for clarification, gently, in writing, with neutral language that sounded helpful, not hesitant. Can you confirm the category you'd like this coded under? Just to make sure we're aligned, should this be treated as X or Y? Happy to process this. Do you want to attach supporting docs for audit? Nothing confrontational, nothing accusatory, but each question created a record. I noticed his responses shift, not in content but in tone, shorter, more abrupt, occasionally delayed, sometimes redirected verbally instead of in writing. He'd stop by my desk instead of replying to emails. He'd call instead of messaging, avoiding documentation. That told me everything I needed to know. And still, I stayed calm. I didn't escalate. I didn't argue. I didn't tighten visibly. I simply adjusted my posture within the system. To him, my continued silence confirmed his assumption that I was still on his side, that I valued harmony over scrutiny, that I wouldn't make trouble. That assumption gave me space to ensure my own work was beyond reproach, space to separate my actions from his decisions, space to understand the mechanics of accountability, where it flowed, where it pooled, where it evaporated. Silence, when chosen, is not absence. It's positioning. I began to understand how often people mistake restraint for weakness, how power relaxes around those it believes will never resist, how systems reveal themselves most clearly when no one feels threatened. And I let that happen. I didn't warn him. I didn't hint. I didn't drop clues or express discomfort. I didn't try to change his behavior because change wasn't my goal. Clarity was. There were moments, small ones, where he tested the boundary, where he'd phrase a request just vaguely enough to see if I'd still fill in the gaps, where he'd imply urgency to bypass the process. And each time I responded the same way, calm, professional, written, not no, not this is wrong, just please confirm. He grew more impatient, less careful, and paradoxically more confident. Power doesn't like being challenged, but it really doesn't notice when it's being observed. I remember thinking at one point that if he had stopped, if he had corrected course, documented properly, respected the boundaries, I would have followed him there. I didn't want this to become something else, but he didn't. Because from his perspective, Nothing had changed. From mine, everything had. Silence had become my strategy. Not to protect him, not to protect the company, but to protect the truth and my place within it. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being passive. It becomes patient. What they never noticed was how much time I spent learning, not studying in an obvious way, not asking questions that would raise flags, just paying attention to the structure beneath the surface. The parts of the organization most people only think about when something breaks. I learned how approvals actually worked, not how they were supposed to work. Which signatures mattered, which ones were ceremonial, which systems talked to each other, and which didn't, where records were immutable and where they could be cleaned up later. I learned the language of compliance, not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that lives in footnotes and internal guidelines, the kind that assumes good faith and therefore relies on patterns to detect abuse. Patterns I already had. I reviewed audit trails, access logs, retention policies. I made sure I understood exactly how long records were kept, who could alter them, and under what circumstances. And I made sure my own actions were boring, predictable, documented, defensible. No shortcuts, no favors, no just this once. If something didn't meet standard, I didn't fix it creatively. I escalated it procedurally, not upward, sideways, through systems designed to ask questions without emotion. What they never noticed was how often I removed myself from the chain. I ensured approvals came from the right level. I separated duties where possible. I reduced my exposure quietly so that if anything were ever reviewed, my role would be clear, limited, and appropriate. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't ask permission. I just aligned more closely with policy than with personalities. That's the advantage of being underestimated. No one watches you closely when they think you're harmless. My boss, in particular, seemed relieved by my continued calm. He stopped hovering, stopped checking in. He trusted that I'd keep things moving. And I did, just not in the way he assumed. I also noticed how isolated he was becoming, how few people truly understood the details of what he was doing, how much he relied on informal processes and verbal understandings, how often he bypassed people who might ask harder questions. It wasn't arrogance, it was momentum. When something works for long enough, it stops feeling risky. I didn't collect evidence the way people imagine. No secret folders, no dramatic gotcha files. I didn't need to. The evidence already existed. It lived in systems designed to preserve it. All I did was make sure it stayed intact. I stopped correcting errors that benefited him unless they were corrected through proper channels. I stopped absorbing risk quietly. I let friction appear where it was supposed to. And slowly, very slowly, the environment changed. Not visibly, but structurally. Things took longer. Questions came back from finance. Requests were returned with comments. Processes that had once flowed smoothly began to resist. No one blamed me. They couldn't. I was following the rules. That's the part people misunderstand about preparation. It's not aggressive. It's not exciting. It's often indistinguishable from diligence. But diligence, applied consistently, reveals truths that shortcuts conceal. There were days I wondered if I was overreacting, if I were building something that would never be needed, if all this care would amount to nothing. And then I'd see another request routed strangely. Another explanation that didn't match the numbers. Another attempt to keep things off the record. And I'd know I was exactly where I needed to be. Because preparation isn't about certainty, it's about readiness. What they never noticed was that I wasn't waiting for the right moment. I was making sure that when the moment arrived, whenever it did, I wouldn't be scrambling. I wouldn't be emotional. I wouldn't be exposed. I would be steady. And steady is very hard to argue with. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I gasped or smiled or felt vindicated. It arrived quietly, like most truths do, when you stop looking for reassurance and start accepting what's already there. I was running a routine internal cross-check, something I'd done dozens of times before, mostly to ensure consistency between systems that weren't designed to talk to each other. It was tedious work, the kind people assume computers handle automatically. They don't. That's where the gaps live. As the data aligned on my screen, the picture sharpened, not into something shocking, but into something undeniable. The irregularities I'd noticed earlier weren't isolated. They were part of a structure, a method. Company funds weren't just being miscoded, they were being redirected, gradually, strategically, always below thresholds that triggered automatic review, always justified after the fact with explanations that sounded reasonable, unless you placed them side by side, which I had. The money didn't disappear. It moved to accounts and expenses that benefited one person disproportionately, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through intermediaries, always with plausible deniability, and always with my role positioned close enough to take the fall if scrutiny ever came. I remember closing my eyes, not in fear, but in recognition. This was it. Not the end of the story, but the point where uncertainty ended. What struck me most was how calm I felt. No anger, no triumph. Just a kind of sober clarity that comes when you finally stop doubting your own perception. I didn't print anything. I didn't forward files. I didn't even bookmark the screen. I already knew where everything was. I sat there and thought, not about what he'd done, but about what I would do. Because discovery doesn't demand action. It demands discernment. I understood in that moment that this wasn't something I could confront directly, not safely, not fairly. Power doesn't respond well to exposure, especially when it believes it controls the narrative. And my boss absolutely believed that. I also understood that this wasn't about punishment. It wasn't my role to decide outcomes. It was my role to ensure that truth, if it ever needed to stand on its own, would be able to. So I did what I'd been doing all along. Nothing. Outwardly, I finished my work, logged out, went home, made dinner, lived my life. But internally, something settled. The ambiguity was gone. From that day forward, every interaction carried context. Every request had weight. Every casual assumption he made about my silence now rested on a foundation that no longer existed. I stopped hoping he would stop. I stopped wondering if I was mistaken. I stopped feeling responsible for managing his risk. And that changed everything. The reveal wasn't about leverage. Not yet. It was about choice. Because once you know the truth, you have three options: ignore it, expose it recklessly, or position yourself so that when it surfaces, inevitably, you are standing in the right place. I chose the third, not because it was clever, because it was ethical. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want credit. I didn't want to be part of a spectacle that would damage people who had nothing to do with this. I wanted separation, clear lines, clear records, clear accountability, and that meant patience. The kind of patience that doesn't wait passively but prepares quietly. That private reveal didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel grounded because I finally understood the landscape I was standing on and where the fault lines were. And once you see that clearly, the next step isn't reaction. It's a decision. Knowing something and deciding what to do with it are very different experiences. For a while, I lived in the space between them. I didn't rush myself. I didn't dramatize the choice. I laid out the options the way I'd learned to lay out everything else, methodically, without emotion clouding the edges. Option one was the easiest: do nothing. Plenty of people choose this. They convince themselves it's not their responsibility, that the system will correct itself, that speaking up will only create chaos. I understood the appeal. Silence would protect my routine, my income, my reputation as the dependable one, but it would also bind me permanently to something I no longer trusted. And I knew that if this ever came out without my having acted appropriately, I didn't know what to do, would not protect me. Option two was confrontation. I imagined it clearly: closing the door, laying out what I'd seen, asking for an explanation, maybe even an apology. It was tempting in its simplicity, but it relied on a dangerous assumption that truth alone would be enough. Power doesn't like being challenged, especially not privately, especially not by someone it considers beneath notice. A confrontation would only teach him what I knew and give him time to adjust, to erase, to redirect blame. I would lose the one advantage I had: his certainty that I posed no threat. Option three was exposure, reporting everything immediately, triggering an investigation, letting the system do what it was designed to do. This option was ethically clean, but practically messy. Investigations don't move surgically. They ripple outward. Teams get disrupted. Innocent people get questioned. Reputations are damaged long before conclusions are reached. And I would be at the center of it, not as a witness, but as a participant. I had no desire to be a symbol. I wanted accountability, not chaos. Which left the fourth option, the one that didn't feel dramatic enough to be satisfying, but felt solid enough to be right. Positioning. I chose to protect myself first, without harming anyone else, and to let truth surface through the channels designed to handle it when the conditions were right. That meant continuing exactly as I had been, but with one critical difference. I stopped making decisions that entangled me further. I reduced my discretionary actions. I clarified responsibilities in writing. I ensured that approvals came from where they should, even when it slowed things down. I didn't push the truth forward. I let it breathe. There's a misconception that decisive action always looks bold. Sometimes, the most decisive thing you can do is not accelerate, because acceleration benefits the person already in control. I knew that eventually the inconsistencies would become visible to someone else. Audits are cyclical, reviews are inevitable, systems catch up. My job was to make sure that when that happened, I was standing on clean ground. This wasn't cowardice, it was a restraint. And restraint is a form of strength that rarely gets credit because it doesn't announce itself. The moment I made that decision, something eased inside me. The anxiety I hadn't fully acknowledged receded, not because the situation was resolved, but because my path through it was. I didn't need to know the outcome. I just needed to know I was no longer complicit. From that point on, my actions aligned with my values without requiring confrontation, explanation, or permission. I had chosen the irreversible path, not toward exposure, but toward integrity. And once you choose that, there's no going back to pretending. Everything after that was movement. Quiet, steady, unavoidable. From the outside, nothing changed. That was the point. I came in at the same time. I spoke in the same measured tone. I answered messages promptly. I delivered work that was clean, accurate, and on time. If anyone had been asked, they would have said I was consistent. Internally, though, I was moving with purpose. Every action I took reduced exposure. Mine, not his. I made sure responsibilities were clearly segmented, that approvals were documented. Those requests landed where they belonged, not where they were convenient. I didn't refuse tasks. I reframed them. Can you process this? Became, once it's approved, I'll process it. Just handle it. Became, I'll need confirmation before proceeding. Small shifts, invisible shifts, but they mattered. I also made sure that I was no longer the sole point of failure. I documented processes thoroughly. I shared knowledge selectively, not to alarm, but to normalize transparency. I made it harder for any one person's actions to be hidden behind my competence. This wasn't sabotage, it was alignment. I consulted policy the way others consult authority. I let systems speak where people preferred discretion. And because I wasn't accusing anyone, no one could accuse me of disloyalty. The legal and financial frameworks were already there. I simply stepped fully into them. My boss noticed friction, but not the source. He grew more impatient with the process, more dismissive of safeguards. He complained about red tape and overhead, unaware that the very systems he was brushing against were now holding firm. And still he didn't suspect me, because I never changed my posture toward him. I didn't withdraw. I didn't cool. I didn't act cautiously around him. I stayed professional, neutral, and responsive. That's the mistake people make. They think preparation looks like distance. It doesn't. It looks calm. I also began to think about my future beyond this situation. Not dramatically, practically. I updated my records, ensured my performance history was clear. I quietly reconnected with professional contacts I trusted, not to complain, but to maintain perspective. Not an exit plan, an independence plan, because true leverage isn't about threat, it's about choice. The days passed, weeks. On the surface, everything functioned. Beneath it, pressure was building, not because of me, but because shortcuts eventually collide with structure. And structure, once engaged, doesn't care who you are. I remember one moment clearly. My boss asked why something was taking longer than usual. I explained evenly that it was waiting on confirmation. He waved it off. Just do it. And for the first time, I didn't. I smiled and said, once it's approved, I will. No tension, no challenge, just a fact. He stared at me for a second longer than usual, then walked away. That was the moment I knew the shift was real. Not because he was angry, but because he was uncomfortable. Power notices when its assumptions stop working. But by then, it was already too late to reset them. I wasn't moving toward confrontation. I was moving toward inevitability. The first signs didn't look like consequences. They looked like an inconvenience. Requests started coming back with questions attached. Approvals stalled in places they hadn't before. A few expenses were flagged, not rejected, just paused. The kind of pauses that force someone to explain themselves more than they're used to. My boss noticed, of course, but he interpreted it the way people often do when systems resist them, as incompetence somewhere else. Finance is being ridiculous. Legal is slowing everything down. They're overreacting. He said these things to me, expecting agreement, expecting me to smooth it over the way I always had. I didn't disagree. I simply nodded and said, they're just following procedure. That sentence became a wall, not a dramatic one, not an aggressive one, just something solid he couldn't talk his way through. What changed next was subtle but telling. He began to feel the loss before he understood the cause. Things he used to move quickly now take time. Things he handled informally now required explanation. He was asked to clarify decisions he'd never had to justify before. And because these changes didn't come from me directly, he had nowhere to aim his frustration. That's when power starts to unravel. Not when it's challenged head on, but when it encounters resistance it can't personalize. Around the office, people felt it too. Not as an alarm, but as friction. Meetings ran longer, budgets tightened, plans were revised. No one panicked, no one accused, but the atmosphere shifted. I watched it happen with a strange sense of detachment. Not satisfaction, recognition. This was what accountability looked like before it had a name. My boss began to hover again. Not over systems, over people. He checked in more often, asked more questions, wanted reassurance that things were under control. I gave it to him truthfully. Yes, I said, everything is being handled appropriately. That word, appropriately, did a lot of work. He didn't realize yet that what he was losing wasn't cooperation. It was covered. Because for a long time, my quiet competence had absorbed the shock of his decisions. Now, that competence was still there, but it was no longer cushioning him. The system was. I noticed something else too. He started looking for shortcuts again, asking if there was another way, suggesting alternatives that felt familiar. Each time I responded the same way. Happy to look at that. Can you put it in writing? Once we have approval, we can move forward. He stopped asking me certain things. That was new. Instead, he began reaching around me, contacting others, pushing boundaries elsewhere, and that only accelerated what was already in motion. Because the more people involved, the less contained things become. Questions multiplied, inconsistencies surfaced. Threads were pulled, not dramatically, just persistently. I didn't celebrate any of it. I stayed focused on my work, on clarity, on separation. Emotionally, I felt calm, not vindicated, not anxious, just steady. The truth about consequences is that they rarely arrive with a bang. They arrive as a narrowing of space, a shrinking of options, a gradual realization that the rules you've been bending are no longer bending with you. My boss felt that narrowing before he understood why. And when he finally looked at me, not as infrastructure, not as background, but as a variable, it was already too late to ask the right questions. The moment of panic didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, a delayed approval here, a meeting that suddenly included legal there. An email was forwarded with a quiet, "Can you clarify?" attached. My boss started losing sleep. I could see it in the way he carried himself, less relaxed, more alert. The confidence that had once flowed effortlessly now felt forced, over-articulated. He began asking questions he should have asked months ago. Why is this flagged now? Who changed the process? Since when do we need this level of detail? Each question carried the same underlying realization. Control was slipping, and still, he didn't understand why. That's the cruelest part of accountability when you're not prepared for it. By the time you notice it, the conditions for fixing it have already passed. He tried to backfill documentation, to retroactively justify decisions, to clean up categories that had long been settled. But systems remember. Timestamps don't bend. Audit trails don't forget. The more he tried to reassert control, the more visible the gaps became. I watched him attempt to charm his way out of it, joking in meetings, minimizing concerns, framing everything as a misunderstanding. And for a while, it almost worked. Almost, because charm doesn't work on records. At some point, he turned his attention to me, not aggressively, not yet. He asked for help, not openly, but indirectly. Wanted to know if I remembered certain decisions, if I could explain why things were coded the way they were, if I could reassure others that everything was fine. This was the moment he expected loyalty, the kind that erases doubt. I gave him accuracy instead. I answered only what I knew. I referenced documentation. I didn't speculate. I didn't fill in gaps with intention or interpretation, just facts. He noticed. The look he gave me wasn't anger. It was a calculation. That's when he realized something had changed, but he misidentified what it was. He thought I was distancing myself. He didn't understand that distance had already been built into the system. The pressure intensified. Meetings became more frequent. The tone shifted from dismissive to urgent, from confident to brittle. He was trying to fix it, but fixes require access, and access had already narrowed. Because once multiple departments are involved, once questions are documented, once timelines are established, you can't quietly rewind. You can only explain. And explanations, when they come too late, reveal more than they resolve. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, only a quiet sadness. Not for him, but for how avoidable it all had been. If he had stopped earlier, if he had respected boundaries, if he had understood that silence isn't consent. But he hadn't. And now, the system was doing what it always does when inconsistencies reach a certain density. It was paying attention. I stayed where I was, calm, available, professional. I didn't withdraw support. I didn't escalate. I didn't gossip or hint. I let the process run, because by then, nothing could be reversed without acknowledging what had already happened. An acknowledgement, once required, is no longer optional. It was too late to fix it. All that remained was to face it. When the confrontation finally came, it didn't look the way people imagined. There was no slamming door, no raised voices, no dramatic accusations thrown across a desk. It happened in a small conference room, mid-morning, with the blinds half open and a neutral calendar invite that simply read, "Check-in." My boss sat across from me with a folder in front of him. He didn't open it right away. He looked tired, not frantic, controlled but strained, like someone holding a structure together with willpower alone. He started calmly. "There are some questions coming up," he said, "about past transactions, processes." I nodded. They're asking how things were handled, he continued. And since you were involved in operations, I wanted to make sure we're aligned. Aligned. That word again. I waited. Silence does a remarkable thing. It invites people to reveal what they're actually asking. He leaned forward slightly. I just need to understand how you're framing this, what you're saying when they ask. I understood then what this meeting was meant to be. Not a discussion, a calibration. He wasn't asking for the truth. He was asking for consistency. I kept my voice even. I'm answering based on records and policy. He frowned. Not sharply, but enough to register discomfort. Right, he said, but context matters. I met his eyes, calmly. Context is in the documentation. That was it. No accusation, no challenge, just a boundary stated plainly. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed, as if releasing something he'd been holding too tightly. You know, he said, I always thought of you as someone I could trust. I didn't react. I still am, I replied. That's why I'm being precise. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was resigned. He finally opened the folder, glanced at the contents, then closed it again. They're going to look closely, he said, not as a threat, as a fact. I understand, I said. He studied me then, not as infrastructure, not as background, but as someone fully present, someone no longer absorbent. I could see the realization settle. This wasn't defiance. It was finality. There was nothing else for him to say. Nothing for me to add. The conversation ended the way it began, quietly, professionally. I walked back to my desk and returned to my work. No adrenaline, no shaking hands, no sense of victory, just relief. Because confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be decisive. It doesn't have to humiliate or overpower. Sometimes it's simply the moment where you refuse to distort yourself for someone else's comfort. That meeting didn't change the outcome, it confirmed it. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt fully aligned with myself. After everything settled, after the questions, the reviews, the quiet reshuffling that happens when systems correct themselves, I wasn't left with triumph. I was left with clarity. My boss eventually left the company, not in disgrace, not with headlines, just gone. His role redefined. His authority was redistributed. The kind of ending that doesn't invite commentary, only understanding from those who were paying attention. I wasn't asked to explain myself. I wasn't praised. I wasn't punished. I was simply still there. And that, strangely, mattered more than anything else. For a long time, I'd believed that being underestimated was something to overcome. That visibility was the reward for endurance. If I just stayed reliable long enough, someone would notice the weight I carried. What I learned instead was quieter and far more durable. I learned that power isn't always loud, and neither is strength. That integrity doesn't require performance, that you don't need permission to stop carrying what isn't yours. I'm still calm, still observant, still not the loudest voice in the room. But I'm no longer invisible to myself. I understand now that silence is not a default state. It's a tool, one that can protect you or erase you, depending on how consciously you use it. I don't offer it automatically anymore. I chose it. When I speak now, it's because something needs to be said, not because I'm filling space or defending my place. When I don't, it's because the system can speak for itself. I also changed how I define loyalty. Loyalty to people without accountability is just obedience. Loyalty to values, That's something else entirely. That's what holds under pressure. I didn't leave the company. I didn't reinvent myself dramatically. I didn't become harder or colder. I became clearer. Clear about boundaries, clear about responsibility, clear about where my role begins and ends. I no longer absorb chaos quietly. I don't smooth over decisions I didn't make. I don't protect others from consequences they've earned. And because of that, I'm trusted differently now, not as infrastructure, as a professional. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can withstand scrutiny without fear, from knowing that if someone looks closely at your work, they'll find alignment, not shortcuts. That confidence doesn't need to announce itself, it just stands. If there's one thing this experience reshaped, it's my relationship with fear. I used to think fear meant danger. Now, I understand it often means information, something inside you recognizing a boundary being crossed before your mind has words for it. I listen to that now, not impulsively, not emotionally, but respectfully, because the version of me who stayed quiet out of habit did the best she could with what she knew, and the version of me who stayed quiet by choice, that one learned how to stand without being seen until it mattered. That's who I am now. Not louder, just anchored. When I look back on this story now, what stays with me isn't the wrongdoing itself. It's how ordinary everything felt while it was happening. There was no villain monologue, no moment where someone announced they were crossing a line. Just a series of small decisions, some careless, some calculated, stacked quietly on top of each other. And beneath them, people like me, doing our jobs, assuming that integrity would be met with integrity in return. That assumption is what this story gently challenges. Power doesn't always abuse loudly. Often it tests softly. It looks for the places where people are conscientious, accommodating, and eager to keep things running. It leans most heavily on those who don't want to cause trouble. And when it isn't questioned, it doesn't correct itself. What I learned is that justice doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as alignment, as systems are finally seeing what individuals were asked to carry alone, as responsibility returning to where it belongs, not because someone demanded it, but because the truth was allowed to stand without distortion. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. I didn't gain status or applause. I didn't become a symbol of courage. What I gained was something quieter and far more sustaining. I learned that you don't need to match force with force to reclaim your ground. That restraint, when paired with clarity, can be more powerful than confrontation. That silence, when chosen consciously, can protect truth rather than bury it. Most importantly, I learned that you are not required to sacrifice yourself to keep a system comfortable, especially when that system depends on your invisibility. If you're in a position where you feel relied on but unheard, trusted but unprotected, where your ethics are quietly doing more work than anyone acknowledges, this isn't a call to act dramatically. It's a reminder to see clearly, to document, to understand where responsibility truly sits, to stop absorbing risk that isn't yours, to know that protecting yourself doesn't mean betraying others. It means refusing to lie on their behalf. There is a difference between patience and self-erasure, and there is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself until it has to. If this story resonates, I hope it offers you permission not to escalate recklessly, but to pause, to observe, to choose your silence carefully, or to break it when alignment demands. Because power may not like being challenged, but it cannot withstand clarity forever. Before we end, I want to leave you with one question, not as a provocation, but as an invitation. Have you ever realized quietly that staying calm was actually the most powerful choice you could make? And if so, what did it change for you? Thank you for listening.